What if everything you learned about Columbus discovering America is completely wrong? What if Chinese admirals with fleets of massive treasure ships had already mapped the entire New World 70 years before Columbus even set sail? This isn't some wild conspiracy theory. It's a claim that's been making waves in academic circles for over 20 years, backed by mysterious maps, ancient petroglyphs, and evidence that could rewrite history books forever. But here's the thing. Most historians think it's complete bullshit. So who's right? Before we dive into the controversy, let's talk about the man at the center of it all, Admiral Zheng He, and trust me, this guy was no joke. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He commanded treasure fleets that make Columbus's 3 little ships look like bathtub toys. We're talking about vessels over 400 feet long. That's longer than a football field, carrying crews of 30,000 men across the Indian Ocean. These Chinese expeditions reached India, the Arabian Peninsula, and the east coast of Africa decades before any European even dreamed of sailing that far. The Chinese were conducting international diplomacy, establishing trade routes, and flexing their naval muscle when Europe was still figuring out how to sail beyond their own coastlines. But here's where the story gets interesting and controversial. In 2002, a former British submarine commander named Gavin Menzies dropped what he claimed was a historical bombshell. His book, 1421 The Year China Discovered the World, argued that Chinese fleets didn't just dominate the Indian Ocean. They sailed all the way around the globe, mapping Australia, rounding Cape Horn, and reaching the Americas in 1421. According to Menzies, when Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, he was basically following maps that Chinese admirals had already drawn 70 years earlier. The book became an international bestseller, sparked documentaries, and had people questioning everything they thought they knew about the age of exploration. But here's where things get messy. The academic establishment absolutely tore this theory apart. If you're fascinated by historical controversies that challenge everything we think we know, hit that subscribe button right now. Professional historians didn't just disagree with Menzies. They went to war against his claims with the fury of scholars protecting their territory. The Journal of World History published a devastating review calling his evidence uniformly without substance. Chinese historical experts pointed out that Ming Dynasty records, which document everything down to the smallest details of Zheng He's expeditions, contain absolutely zero mention of any trans-Pacific voyages. Think about it. The Chinese kept meticulous records of everything, including how much rice each sailor ate and what gifts they brought back from Africa. But somehow they forgot to mention discovering an entire new continent? That's like forgetting to mention you found Atlantis. But wait, the story doesn't end with academic criticism, because in 2015, something really interesting happened. A retired analytical chemist named John Ruskamp published research claiming he'd found ancient Chinese characters carved into rock faces across the American Southwest. We're talking about petroglyphs in New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, California, and Oklahoma that supposedly match archaic Chinese scripts. Ruskamp identified dozens of these potential matches and even provided translations, suggesting that Chinese explorers had left their mark on American stone centuries before Columbus. Now, this sounds incredible. Actual physical evidence of Chinese presence in pre-Columbian America. But here's where the plot thickens even more. Rock art specialists and archaeologists looked at Ruskamp's claims and raised some serious red flags. First problem. Dating petroglyphs is incredibly difficult without proper archaeological context, and many of these sites have been contaminated by modern visitors over the decades. Second problem. Human beings are pattern-seeking machines, and we're really good at seeing faces in clouds and meaningful symbols where none exist. Third problem. Similar-looking symbols can develop independently in completely different cultures, so visual similarity doesn't prove historical connection. But the biggest problem is this: if Chinese expeditions really had reached and explored the American Southwest, where's the rest of the evidence? Where are the Chinese artifacts, the burial sites, the remains of camps or settlements? Then there's the whole map situation, which is where this story gets really wild. Supporters of the China First theory point to several historical maps, including something called the 1418 Chinese World Map, which allegedly shows accurate coastlines of the Americas decades before Columbus. There's also the famous Piri-Reis map from 1513, which some claim incorporates Chinese knowledge of American geography. But here's the thing about old maps: they're notoriously difficult to authenticate, and they've been copied, modified, and sometimes completely fabricated over the centuries. Map experts who've studied these documents have raised serious questions about their authenticity and provenance. Some have called the 1418 map an outright hoax, while others suggest the Piri-Reis map simply copied information from Columbus's own charts. Here's what really frustrates professional archaeologists and historians about these claims: extraordinary theories require extraordinary evidence, and that evidence simply doesn't exist. If Chinese fleets had really established any kind of sustained presence in the Americas, we would expect to find undisputable archaeological evidence. We're talking about Chinese-made tools, pottery, coins, weapons, burial goods, items that could be carbon dated and verified through scientific analysis. But after decades of archaeological work across the Americas, not a single confirmed Chinese artifact predating Columbus has been found in a secure, undisturbed context. Compare that to what we know about actual historical contact. When Europeans arrived, they left behind tons of archaeological evidence that we can date, analyze, and trace back to specific regions and time periods. The absence of similar Chinese evidence is deafening. So why do these theories keep coming back despite the lack of solid evidence? Part of it is the appeal of the underdog story. There's something satisfying about challenging the established historical narrative and suggesting that mainstream scholars have got it all wrong. There's also national pride involved. Different countries and cultures want to claim credit for major historical achievements, and discovering the Americas is about as major as it gets. Plus, let's be honest, Chinese admirals secretly mapped the world decades before Columbus. Makes for a much more exciting story than Columbus followed existing trade routes and got lucky. The problem is that exciting stories don't automatically become true stories, no matter how much we want them to be. So what's the final verdict on whether China beat Columbus to the Americas? Based on the current evidence, or rather, the lack thereof, the mainstream historical consensus is clear: there's no credible proof that Chinese expeditions reached or mapped the Americas before 1492. The Zheng He expeditions were real and impressive, but they stopped at the eastern edge of the Indian Ocean. The petroglyphs are intriguing but lack the archaeological context needed to prove Chinese origin. The maps are either questionable in authenticity or can be explained by post-Columbian knowledge transfer. Does that mean it's impossible that Chinese sailors ever reached American shores before Columbus? No, absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence. But it does mean that until we find concrete, independently verifiable proof, the safest position is skepticism. So what would it take to convince mainstream historians that Chinese explorers really did reach the Americas first? The answer is pretty straightforward. We need the kind of hard, physical evidence that can withstand rigorous scientific scrutiny. We're talking about Chinese artifacts found in undisturbed archaeological layers that can be carbon dated to before 1492. We need Chinese coins, tools, pottery, or weapons discovered in contexts that haven't been contaminated by later visitors or collectors. We need contemporary Chinese documents that explicitly describe trans-Pacific voyages and American landfalls, not vague references that could be interpreted multiple ways. We need genetic evidence showing pre-Columbian contact between Asian and Native American populations in the specific regions where Chinese expeditions supposedly landed. Basically, we need the same kind of evidence that proves Viking contact with North America around 1000 AD, physical artifacts, documented sites, and scientific verification. Until that evidence appears, the historical consensus will remain unchanged. Look, I get why these alternative history theories are so appealing. They challenge our assumptions, they make us question what we think we know, and they offer the tantalizing possibility that everything we learned in school might be incomplete. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Questioning established narratives is how we make progress in understanding the past. But there's a crucial difference between healthy skepticism and wishful thinking. Healthy skepticism demands evidence, requires verification, and changes its mind when presented with better data. Wishful thinking starts with a conclusion and then cherry-picks evidence to support it, ignoring anything that doesn't fit the preferred narrative. The China reached America first theory might make for compelling reading and interesting documentaries, but until it's backed by solid archaeological and documentary evidence, it remains in the category of historical speculation rather than historical fact. Here's my challenge to you. The next time you come across a sensational historical claim, whether it's about ancient Chinese explorers, lost civilizations, or alien visitors, ask yourself these questions. What's the quality of the evidence? Has it been independently verified by multiple experts? Does it require you to ignore or dismiss well-established facts? And most importantly, are you believing it because the evidence is convincing, or because you want it to be fascinating enough without making stuff up? and the real stories of human exploration and cultural contact are often more incredible than any fiction we could invent. So what do you think? Have I convinced you that the China first theory doesn't hold water? Or do you think there's still compelling evidence out there waiting to be discovered? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to hear your take on this historical mystery. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into historical controversy, make sure to subscribe for more videos where we separate fact from fiction in the stories that shaped our world. Because the truth is always more interesting than the myth.